It sounds like they're waiving the confidentiality just for that. That's beautiful. This is fantastic. Jesus.
So,
I imagine all of that is on tape.
So they went ahead and agreed to be recorded.
Good.
And gave all the details from every minute what happened.
It was almost spring in Los Angeles. The days were getting longer, and much like the trees of California, the Menendez investigation was finally starting to bear fruit. It had been 7 months since Kitty and Jose were gunned down in their living room. Police suspected their sons had something to do with it. Erik and Lyle had gotten more than $500,000 from insurance, and they were in a rush to spend their windfall on Rolexes and fancy cars. The cops also learned that the brothers hired an expert to wipe their family computer. Erik and Lyle knew their father's original will listed them as heirs. They worried the latest will would disinherit them, so they had it destroyed. The police had their suspicions, but they had no guns, no witnesses, and no confession. They couldn't directly link the brothers to the crime. It's strange to think that a case that became one of the most watched trials on TV might have never gotten solved if not for one woman.
Judalon Smyth. Spell both those, please. Judalon. Smyth, Smyth.
All right.
Judalon Smyth had never met the Menendez brothers, but she knew their darkest secrets. I'm your host, Vinny Politan, and this is Murder and the Menendez Brothers, a court TV mystery. I'm a former prosecutor and journalist, and now lead anchor for Court TV. Today, Episode 2, The Tapes. Smyth was an entrepreneur in Los Angeles. She had this reddish blonde bob that grazed over her shoulders. She was in her 20s, but already ran her own small business. Smyth could be audacious in some moments, but perhaps too trusting in others. One day, she was listening to a tape of Dr. L. Jerome Ozil. At the time, he was a psychologist known for his expertise in phobias and, quote, sex-related disorders.
I had some tapes from a seminar, which I had listened to, and I was interested in taking some of those seminars.
So she reached out to Dr. Ozil, and in no time, he got her to change her mind.
He called me back and talked me out of the seminars and into the idea that I needed one-on-one therapy.
Okay, maybe this quick pivot should have raised red flags, but it didn't. Smyth was game. But from there, their doctor-patient relationship became something else.
It would flip-flop between therapy and his idea that he was my ideal person romantically.
Not exactly above board, especially since Dr. Ozil was married with 2 children. But in the summer of 1989, Judalon Smyth and Dr. Ozil became involved. Every extramarital affair comes with strings attached. That's par for the course. But this one would make Judalon Smyth privy to a lot more than she bargained for. A few months into their relationship, Dr. Ozil was at her house when he got an urgent message. Erik Menendez needed to talk. It had been months since Erik or Lyle had come in for a therapy session. Dr. Ozil wondered, what could be so urgent now?
And so from my house, he called Erik and spoke with him and set up an appointment.
Erik was frantic. He demanded to see Dr. Ozil as soon as possible, but only under certain conditions. He needed to talk alone, after business hours. So they set up an appointment for the evening of Halloween. Dr. Ozil had an inkling of what it could be about.
When he hung up the phone, he said that he hoped he wasn't going to hear what he thought he was going to hear. And when I asked him what he thought he was going to hear, he said that they killed their parents.
Naturally, Dr. Ozil was worried about being alone with a killer. So he wanted a witness nearby. That's how Smyth got roped in.
He was asking me to come and be there in case something happened to him.
On Halloween, Erik arrived at his therapist's office, and soon after, Dr. Ozil asked him to call his brother Lyle. He wanted both of them there to get the full story, all at once. When Lyle arrived, he was furious. In the waiting room, Judalon Smyth was on high alert, ready to listen to what was about to unfold.
He just, told me to pay attention and listen carefully, and if I, heard anything that seemed like he was in danger, that I was to call the police.
Judalon Smyth sat quietly in the empty waiting room. Through the thin walls, she heard bits and pieces.
Lyle was very angry, and he was yelling at his brother that he was angry at him. He was just upset with him and couldn't believe that he had done this or said this.
The session lasted 4 hours. After the brothers left, Dr. Ozil filled in the gaps for Smyth. It was just as he expected, he told her. The brothers had admitted to killing their parents. Smyth couldn't believe what she was hearing. Months ago, the story of a double homicide in Beverly Hills had been all over the news, but the slain couple's sons had never been considered suspects. Dr. Ozil and Judalon Smyth were terrified. Now they knew the truth. Who was to say that Lyle and Erik wouldn't come after them, too? It wasn't speculation. Dr. Ozil said,
they had threatened him and everyone connected to him, and that it wasn't safe.
Smyth thought their only option was to call the police. But Dr. Ozil wouldn't hear it.
I told Ozil that we should go to the police. Then he said that the Menendez brothers owned the police.
He told her calling the cops would be suicide.
So the minute that, anyone went to the police and told them anything about them, that the Menendez family would get a phone call and I would be dead.
It was one of those moments that Smyth was perhaps too trusting. They were in this together now, so she stayed quiet. In the weeks that followed, Dr. Ozil saw the brothers for 2 more sessions. He began to think his only way out was to get the brothers to confess on tape. He prided himself on being a persuasive guy. He could get them to explain why they had killed their parents. Maybe then they'd turn themselves in. It turned out Dr. Ozil was right about one thing. He was persuasive. In their last session together, he convinced Erik and Lyle to agree to be on tape, recorded.
He was telling them that the tape would be for their benefit, that if they ever got caught, that he would be their only ally, that he would be the only person who could get them off.
If none of this seems logical, you're right. But somehow, Dr. Ozil convinced the brothers that if the authorities ever came after them, he was their only hope.
And that they would need to have this tape recording in order to prove to a jury that they were remorseful.
If the affair had lasted, maybe then Smyth wouldn't have gone to the cops. But by the spring of 1990, it did end. Over time, Smyth realized Dr. Ozil didn't love her. She said he was manipulating her.
In November, I was slipping into something called the Stockholm Syndrome. He became my lifeline. After the confessions, he became my lifeline.
Dr. Ozil and Judalon Smyth both gave different accounts of what happened after she overheard the brothers confess. But after that night, Smyth says Ozil started using intimidation to keep her quiet.
He said that he would call Lyle and Erik and tell them that I had been outside the door and that I knew and that I was wanting to go to the police and that they would kill me.
By the time the couple broke up, Smyth said Dr. Ozil had done all he could do to shut her up. But his plan backfired. Because now that she was on her own, Smyth said she felt free to do the right thing. She felt bold. On March 5th, 1990, Judalon Smyth called the Beverly Hills Police Department. The very next day, she was in a room with Detective Les Zoller. You remember him. He's been the lead detective since the night of the murders. A district attorney assigned to the case sat in too. Their 6-hour conversation was recorded.
I tried to give the information that I had that would, lead them to be able to make an arrest. And some of that information was about they had purchased the guns with the phony ID and the purchase was made in San Diego.
But most importantly, Smyth told the cops that a taped confession existed. She calls Dr. Ozil Jerry here.
Jerry decided that the boys needed to agree to be tape recorded.
It was at that last therapy session that Jerry got their confession all on tape. This was a major break. The detective and the DA got just what they were looking for from Smyth. They had struck gold.
So they were aware that those tape recordings could be made aware to a third person.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like they're waiving the confidentiality just for that. That's beautiful. This is fantastic. Jesus.
So
I imagine all of that is on tape.
So they went ahead and agreed to be recorded.
Good.
And gave all the details from every minute what happened. And
Both men seem almost giddy with relief. In that moment, they thought the taped confession could be used in court, no problem. Both men thought the brothers had waived confidentiality, but they were wrong. The fight over that taped confession would go all the way to the California Supreme Court. 2 days after Judalon Smyth met with the cops, Beverly Hills police were at Dr. Ozil's home. His wife Laurel opened the door, still in her bathrobe. They had a search warrant, they told her. Her husband was connected to a felony in Beverly Hills. Before Dr. Ozil could ask any questions, the cops were rummaging through their house. He tried telling them about doctor-patient confidentiality. These weren't just any tapes. They were privileged material. Ozil later testified that he
definitely had a significant level of fear at the moment that the police and a number of other people were in my house with a search warrant seizing the materials that I had tried hard to protect and keep secreted all that time.
They searched his house and his office and eventually ended up at his bank. That's where they found a safety deposit box. In that safe, there were audio cassette tapes, diaries, and notes. This was it. The cops on the scene were supposed to put the tapes and notes in a sealed evidence container. Instead,
the police demanded that I play the tapes.
It was a bold move that broke protocol. But the cops said they needed to make sure they had the right evidence. Ozil tried to stop them from listening to the brothers' confession. After all, in the words of Dr. Ozil himself, a therapist is like a minister. People tell therapists their deepest secrets, knowing they'll remain secrets.
We haven't heard the tapes. The court has them under seal. But we have heard from several sources that what's on them will clearly indicate that the sons did kill their parents.
Back at the Menendez mansion, Lyle was getting a late start to his day. He had been up all night playing chess with a friend. It was now early afternoon. Lyle decided to head to lunch with two friends. He was at the wheel. But they would never make it to the Cheesecake Factory. As Lyle backed out of the driveway at 722 Elm Drive for the last time, a police car swerved in front of his Jeep. There was a second cop car in the rearview mirror. There was a moment of stillness on Elm Drive before the chaos erupted. Several police officers got out of their vehicles and surrounded the three men. Their guns were drawn. They were yelling at Lyle and his friends to get down on the ground. Lyle was put in a cement cell at the county jail. His two friends were questioned and released. Lyle was charged with 2 counts of suspicion of murder. He was alone. It was confusing. It had been months. Why was all of this happening now? Since the murders, his brother had been his confidant. Now he wasn't sure who to turn to. Erik was at a tennis tournament in Israel. It was about 7:30 in the morning in Tel Aviv when Erik got a call. It was patched through from the front desk of his hotel. Lyle was in custody. Erik could have run, but he decided to return to the U.S. Erik landed in L.A. 3 days after Lyle's arrest. Detectives met him at the airport, and within hours, Erik was in a cell near his brother, reunited. By now, the news was breaking across America.
7 months after the shootings, Erik Menendez, 19, and Lyle Menendez, 22, were arrested for killing their parents.
The brothers' faces were on every newsstand nationwide. It was a page-1 story. The LA Times cover read, "Sons named in double slayings in Beverly Hills." The public was stunned. Some of Erik and Lyle's relatives couldn't believe it. Their uncle, Carlos Baralt, told the Times, "It's extremely hard to believe anything like this could happen, that the boys were the ones who killed their parents." It made no sense. Why would 2 strapping young men with everything they could ever have or want kill their own blood?
Well, it was a huge story, of course.
That's John Johnson, the former LA Times reporter and author.
I mean, it was a big, high-profile murder. It definitely was the talk of the town. Nobody could figure out exactly how it happened.
And until someone, anyone, figured out what had happened, all of America would be paying attention. We couldn't turn away. This case felt like a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. It made Americans ask themselves, what makes humans so cruel to one another? Cruel even to their family. But it wasn't just the twists and turns of the case that made it a showstopper. It was a case full of big personalities, like Leslie Abramson.
These people are dead and they were killed by their own children. Now you have to ask, if you knew nothing else, what went on in that family for that to happen?
Abramson was a defense attorney who was known for being unrestrained, direct, fiery.
She was perceived as a top-notch defense attorney and somebody you didn't want to go up against if you were a prosecutor.
The Menendez brothers were facing the possibility of the death penalty. That made Leslie Abramson even more interested in their case. She liked a challenge. Capital cases were just that. She had an impressive record of winning them, and she wanted to win for the Menendez brothers. So she took their case. So the first order of business for Abramson: keep Dr. Ozil's tapes out of the courtroom. This move would delay the trial for 3 years while the brothers waited in jail. Abramson contended that Dr. Ozil's tapes could not be admitted in a trial as evidence. Here's law professor Lori Levinson.
Ordinarily, if somebody goes to a psychotherapist and if they're going for therapy, what would be said would be confidential.
That even includes a situation where a client confesses to murder.
But it's not an absolute privilege, and there are exceptions. There are exceptions that came to play in this case.
Abramson argued that it was unlawful that the police had even listened to the tapes that day they charged into Ozil's home. But the prosecutors were saying that the tapes should be allowed because in them, Erik and Lyle can be heard threatening Dr. Ozil's life.
Is something that we call the dangerous patient exception. If in going there, they're making threats to the psychotherapist or to third parties, then that's something that the court can allow to be revealed to the prosecution and even the jury.
The courts batted the case back and forth. Eventually, it went all the way up to the California Supreme Court.
The issue before the California Supreme Court is whether this exception for the dangerous patient would apply at all.
For 3 years, the defense waged an all-out legal war to keep Dr. Ozil and his tape out of court, arguing the psychologist broke the patient-therapist privilege.
That's Terry Moran, the Court TV reporter who covered this case.
But the prosecution argued that the privilege did not apply because the doctor claimed Lyle threatened him, thereby allowing Ozil to break his silence.
Finally, in 1992, nearly 3 years after the murders, the California Supreme Court made their decision. Ozil's notes of sessions would be allowed at trial, but not the tape of the brothers' confession. The Supreme Court ruled that particular tape did not qualify for the dangerous patient exception. That was a setback, but the prosecution got something out of it.
And the prosecution won. The California Supreme Court ruled that Dr. Ozil could be called to testify about his sessions with the brothers.
Dr. Ozil would be the prosecution's star witness. Finally, a date for the Menendez trial was set, July 20th, 1993. By now, Erik was 22, Lyle was 25. Outside the walls of the LA County Prison, the Rodney King riots had come and gone. A new President Clinton had assumed office, and the World Wide Web was now online for the public. But the only thing that mattered to the Menendez brothers was a chance at getting out of prison. A new prosecutor had been assigned their case.
My name is Pamela Bozanich, and I was the lead prosecutor on the first Menendez trial.
Bozanich was one of the first women to be hired by the district attorney's office in L.A.
Up until the time I was assigned the case, I'd done a variety of cases, but a lot of sex crimes, because when I joined the DA's office, they were just starting to hire women, and so all the men took their sex crime cases and gave them to the women to try, figuring that we were better with women and children.
Before this, Bozanich had been working on a child abuse case. It had an unusual distinction. At the time, the longest and most expensive trial in American history. Defense attorney Leslie Abramson had a reputation for winning at any cost, but Pamela Bozanich was her equal.
The ironic thing about it is that her opposite number, Pam, was just as tough. So they made quite a couple, the two of them.
Bozanich worked with investigators on the Menendez case while she wrapped up her work on the child abuse trial. Now, the prosecution had Ozil as a witness, 2 tapes, and a link to the weapons. Lyle and Erik waited 3 long years for their trial to begin, but during that time, something else happened. Court TV launched. The network televised key moments of the Rodney King trial and other courtroom proceedings. Here's Stephen Brill, founder of Court TV, on Charlie Rose.
The reaction we've been getting lately is there are actually more judges and more lawyers in other places around the country that think that there ought to be more televised trials so that people get some kind of a balanced view and see places where the system is actually working.
We reached out to Brill. He was unable to do an interview. But Scott Tufts was working in news when the Menendez case was playing out. He now manages the newsroom at Court TV.
I know the goal was to allow the average American to see the criminal justice system in the way that it actually operates every day, not some kind of filtered version that's delivered on the evening news. A gavel to gavel, here's what happens in a courtroom.
Court TV was considering not just playing snippets of the Menendez trial, they wanted to show it from beginning to the end.
So 1991, that was still part of the dawn of the cable boom. Court TV coming along was just fulfilling another area of compelling live coverage of stories which were fascinating and real.
Viewers would have a front row seat to justice. That wasn't common back then. The Menendez trial was one of the first to be broadcast to the nation. Viewers didn't quite know what to make of it. Here's Lori Levinson again.
People just didn't know that there would be more subtleties to the case because at the time there wasn't a lot of sophistication in how you view a case that's televised, how you comment on a case that's televised, and if in your courtroom, how you act during a case that's televised.
It was a big unknown. How would the Menendez trial be received? Would people be bored? Riveted? If you're old enough to remember anything about the Menendez brothers, you remember that everyone was watching this trial. It became fodder for conversation at home, with friends, and even with strangers. John Johnson, the LA Times reporter, recalls seeing kids dressed up as Erik and Lyle for Halloween.
A few of them would have signs around their necks saying Lyle or Erik, just to make sure that everybody knew what they were doing.
This trial became a cultural phenomenon, thanks to the judge who greenlit cameras in his courtroom. His name was Stanley Weisberg. He met with the defense and prosecution in the Menendez case to discuss whether court TV should be allowed to broadcast.
We met in chambers, and it was decided that we would not have cameras in the courtroom.
It's a little-known fact that he almost refused to let cameras televise the Menendez trial. Here's Court TV's Scott Tufts again.
Many viewers at home, or many Americans, wouldn't know the names Lyle and Erik Menendez without cameras in court for their trial.
Ultimately, the negotiation was between Weisberg and Court TV. It makes me wonder, if cameras hadn't been in the courtroom, would the Menendez brothers have become iconic at all? The defense and the prosecution went off to prepare their opening statements. They thought the only public they would face in the courtroom would be the jury. But the defense had bigger problems than the attention the case was getting. The evidence against the Menendez brothers was overwhelming. Bozanich now says she had an inkling of what the defense's strategy might be.
Miss Abramson's reputation was that she would go to the wall for her clients, that she fought very hard for them, even if a lesser approach might have been more effective. She was very passionate about making sure that her clients were convicted of as little as possible, regardless of how she did it.
Bozanich knew what Leslie Abramson was capable of, but the public had no idea. Prosecutors had the guns, they had the tapes, they even had their therapist as a witness. What could the defense possibly bring to the table? Just a month before the trial began, Leslie Abramson made a stunning announcement that made headlines. It revealed the strategic approach the defense would take in trial.
He did not tell them the true motivation for the killings. To do that, he would have had to reveal the shameful, in his opinion, secrets that he had spent most of his life concealing.
That and more next time.
Murder in the Menendez Brothers, a Court TV mystery, is hosted by Vinny Politan. It's produced by Janaki Mehta and Tanner Robbins of Neon Hum Media. Our editor is Catherine St. Louis. Our engineer is Scott Somerville. The executive producer at Neon Hum Media is Jonathan Hirsch. For Kate's Network Original Productions, Sophia Kelly is the Senior Vice President and Sean Cameron is the Senior Director. Production assistance is provided by Kate Mishkin and Haley Fager. Special thanks to Natalie Wren. You can see Court TV's complete coverage of the first Menendez trial in the Trials on Demand section on our website, courttv.com.